ไม่มีการผสมขึ้น
So, Professor Jerry, can you say something that the translator can translate because they want to test about the translation?
Okay, can you hear me? Testing.
Yeah.
Okay. So, who turned on recording? Who is recording?
Okay. ได้ยินดีภาษาลาว Yeah. So in mod เนาะ Okay, Professor, Lao language is work very well.
Okay.
Yep.
Someone there is recording.
Michael, he's asking who is recording. Wait.
So shall we start? Or just wait?
A few more people have arrived. I'm admitting.
Yeah, now 17 people, and some people just in the class with center with the at Center of Nutrition, I think. because some people said they have some problem to click the link, so that's why
Okay.
take little time.
We can wait a few more minutes.
Yeah, it's okay.
If you are not real loud, you will not know of job.
So I think we can start now because I'm afraid we'll be late for you. So are you ready, Professor?
Sabadi. Okay.
Okay, we can start, right, Professor Jerry?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
โอเคเอาสบายดีทุกท่านเนาะแต่ว่าก่อนสิเฮาสิเข้านี่นะขอให้ทุกท่านมอดเสียงก่อนเนาะถ้าว่าเฮาบ่ได้เว้าเนาะสบายดีทุกท่านยินดีต้อนรับเข้าสู่การสัมมนาเทื่อทําอิฐของพวกเฮาเนาะซึ่งว่าแม่นโครงการ ANRCB มื้อนี้พวกเฮาจะได้มีโอกาสดีที่ได้เชื้อเชิญดร. Gerald ซึ่งแม่นศาสตราจารย์มาจากมหาวิทยาลัย Purdue สหรัฐอเมริกาเพิ่นจะได้มานำเสนอในหัวข้อความเข้าใจรูปแบบการบริโภคอาหารที่หลากหลายในประเทศเนปาลว่างอย่างยิ่งว่าท่านจะได้รับความรู้และมีคำถามหลังสิ้นสุดการนำเสนอพวกเขาจะได้ไปนำใช้ในเวียกพวกเขาคือแนวได้ต่อไปข้อเชิญ Professor Jerry นำเสนอเลยข้อเชิญ Please Jerry Thank you
Great. Good morning, everyone. It's very nice to be with you, and I am glad to see so many participants for today's seminar, the first seminar in a series that we plan to hold throughout the year. Today, I would like to present to you some of the research that I've conducted with one of my PhD students, Alicia Evans. This is work on dietary diversity in Nepal. And I thought it would be an interesting topic for all of us to look at Nepal and some of the patterns that we've observed there. Briefly, here is an outline for the talk that I plan to present. I'll spend a few minutes with an introduction, and I'll tell you a little bit about the motivation for the study, some background, and the research questions that I hope to answer. I'll tell you a little bit about the data that we're using in the study, and then I'll present some results. First, results on dietary diversity, and then I'll describe some findings from regression analysis that we conducted. So, why did I choose Nepal for today's presentation? Well, in fact, there are some similarities and then some differences between Nepal and Laos. And I thought that that would be a useful comparison for us to make. Although Nepal is smaller than Laos, it has a much larger population, and it has a much poorer population. As you can see in the statistics at the bottom of the screen, Nepal has four times the population of Laos. But in both countries, the stunting rate for children below age 5 is very similar. About 1/3 of all children under age 5 are stunted. And both countries have very high levels of ethnic diversity. You can see a very large number of languages spoken in Nepal and a very large number of languages spoken in Laos. So while the countries are different in many respects, they are similar in others. And one other reason why the countries are similar is that they're both landlocked. So the graph that's on the screen shows on the horizontal axis the average household dietary diversity in Nepal, and on the vertical axis, the average height for age z-score, a measure of child linear growth. And each dot in the graph represents a different district in Nepal. So what I want to convey with this graphic is that there is a positive association between dietary diversity and child stunting or child linear growth. But as you can see from the diagram, the relationship, while positive, is by no means deterministic. There's quite wide variation in the relationship, and we'll be looking at why that might be the case. So I want to answer two questions this morning. First, I want to ask the question of how diverse diets are in Nepal. And then second, and maybe more importantly, I want to understand what explains the patterns that we observe between household dietary diversity and consumption of animal-sourced foods, which we know are important for nutritional health and child growth. So the data that we're going to be looking at come from 3 rounds of the Nepal Agricultural Household Survey, which was conducted in 2013, 2014, and 2015. The data cover the experiences of almost 12,000 households, equally split between urban and rural households. And as part of the survey, information was collected on food and non-food expenditures over a 7-day period in the case of food. So 7-day food recall data. And these data were mapped into 12 diet categories. And that mapping is what constitutes our household dietary diversity score. We'll later in the presentation talk about those dietary diversity scores as outcome variables in a series of regressions, as well as some regressions for animal-sourced foods. So I'll show you a few pictures that illustrate dietary diversity. The first graph, and they're all organized in a similar way. The first graph shows a series of dots, and each dot represents a separate district, a geographic unit in Nepal. And as you can see, the average dietary diversity score differs widely geographically in Nepal. So it ranges from a low of near 7, so that would be 7 diet items per household, to a high of just over 10 with an average near 9. And in all cases, the rank of the diet items is most prevalent for cereals, and then less prevalent for other items in the food basket, such as meat, fruit, dairy, fish, and eggs. This graph shows the proportion of households in the survey that consumed vegetables. And as you can see, in nearly all districts in Nepal, consumption of vegetables was quite high, as we might expect. When we look at the consumption of eggs, which is the least widely consumed item in the food basket, we see that the consumption of eggs differs quite widely across households and across districts, ranging from a proportion of 0 households in some districts at the top of the chart to nearly 80% of all households consuming eggs near the bottom of the chart. Similarly, if we look at consumption of fruit by geographic area, it differs widely geographically. And so this is one of the first messages that I think is important to understand in the context of Nepal. And that is that the diversity of household diets varies greatly by location. And we'll come back to that in a moment. Here's the chart for consumption of dairy products, again by district, with wide geographic variation. And finally, animal-sourced foods, the number of animal-sourced food items consumed by households in each district. So this way of displaying the data at the district level gives us a broad view into differences in household dietary diversity. But again, these are data that are displayed at the district level. And so what we want to do next is to look more closely at the data at household level. So we want to understand patterns among and between households. So when we pool all of the data together, so this is all of the districts for all of the years, all 12,000 observations, and we ask what's the relationship between dietary diversity and income, we get a scatter plot that's displayed in the black dots that you see, and a relationship, a correlation, if you will, between income and dietary diversity that's displayed by the red line. So in general, as incomes increase, the diversity of diet in that household increases. And that probably should not be surprising to us. Okay, so before I go forward, I again want to describe the process that we're taking. So each of the dots in this graph represents one observation of a household at a point in time. And in the case of this chart, it displays the income for that household on the horizontal axis and the dietary diversity score for that household on the vertical axis. So each dot, each household is represented in this entire cloud of information. So for each household, we observe not only the dietary diversity score for that household and the income for that whole household, but additional information. And so what we will do is take the dietary diversity score as an outcome variable and then use regression analysis to measure the correlation between that dietary diversity score and a range of other factors. And so in the next slide, I'm going to show you the results from that regression where we've converted all of the regression estimates into elasticity terms. So in this case, we're asking how much does dietary diversity change for a change in one of these other variables that we observe. And the way that you can read this is that for each change in income at the sample mean, the household diversity score, dietary diversity score increases. So that's a positive relationship. Urban households have higher dietary diversity scores. Agricultural households have lower household diversity scores. Female-headed households have higher dietary diversity. Larger households have higher dietary diversity. More educated household heads are associated with households with higher dietary diversity scores. And households that are wealthier in terms of assets have higher dietary diversity scores. In addition, the survey includes information on whether households consume food away from home, in other words, at restaurants, and food consumed away from home is associated with a higher dietary diversity score. And the survey also has information on the density of roads in the area where the household lives. And we see that higher road density is associated with higher dietary diversity. Okay, so those are the results for household dietary diversity. And if we look at the results for animal-sourced foods, we find similar patterns. So higher income leads to greater consumption of animal-sourced foods. Agricultural households consume less. Female-headed households consume more. Highly educated households consume more. And households in districts with greater road density consume more. So one, I think, unsurprising result from this is that greater income leads to greater dietary diversity and greater consumption of animal-sourced foods. I think it's also not surprising that urban households tend to have more diverse diets than rural households. What may be surprising to some of you is that agricultural households have less dietary diversity. We often think of households that are farming as having available a large amount of food items. But in fact, in Nepal, most agricultural households have a relatively small number of food items that are available to them. And the main way that households are able to increase their dietary diversity is through access to markets. So, some conclusions from this. First conclusion is that household diets in Nepal are relatively diverse on average, but the patterns vary considerably, and they vary considerably across location and across income. So if we think about how important location is, we can say that location explains about as much of the variation in diversity scores as the combination of income, wealth, and education. In other words, location all by itself is just about as important as an explanatory variable as income, wealth, and education. Unfortunately, we can't change people's locations easily. Luckily, variables like income and education are variables that can be changed through economic development and through efforts directed at education. If we look at the main factors correlated with dietary diversity, we see that income, wealth, family size, and education are consistently positive. Female headship in a household is positive, but modest in its magnitude. Rural and agricultural households have negative associations with dietary diversity. And road density and consumption outside the home are both correlated with greater dietary diversity. And so the important message there is that access to markets is very important for increasing dietary diversity, as is education and income. Okay, so that concludes the presentation, and we now have time for questions. You can ask questions about the data, you can ask questions about the analysis, how it was done, you can ask questions about the results. We can have a very open discussion for all aspects of the presentation. I want to point out that financial support for the research was provided by the USAID Feed the Future Nutrition Innovation Lab. If you want more details, you can contact me. And in fact, there's a paper that accompanies the presentation. And before we open it up for discussion, I just want to remind everyone that our next seminar will be on November 2nd. Professor Laura Murray-Kolb will be talking about iron deficiency and anemia. So with that, I will open up for questions. And let's see how to do that. Let's see. I think I need to go.
มีไผอยากถามบ่มีเท่าอยากถามหรือว่าแลกเปลี่ยนหยังนำเพิ่นบ่
โดยขออนุญาตถามเลยอาจารย์ Thank you Professor Jerry for your very interesting presentation. So I have question related to food diversity and income. Because you said income is when income is increased, the food diversity also increased. And I would like to ask about did you see at the food that when it related to income, it means that food is from buy or from their household? The first question. And the second question is that the family size is consistently positive with food diversity. And I would like to ask the family size, what it mean? The large family size or the small, or what is the meaning of this? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for the questions. So if I could repeat the question, just to make sure that I have them correct. The first question is about the relationship between income and dietary diversity, and whether the income is associated with food purchases. The second question is why we see this pattern with family size.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, okay. So in the first case, when we measure dietary diversity, we don't differentiate between foods that are purchased and foods that are, for example, produced by agricultural households. But obviously, with half of the sample being urban households, all of those households would be purchasing their food in most cases. And among the agricultural households, it's clear that if a household is agricultural, it's less likely to have a high dietary diversity score. But if it's able to purchase food away from home then that increases the dietary diversity score along with income. So I think your intuition about the relationship is correct, that the primary way that income is associated with dietary diversity is that income allows households in Nepal to purchase food items, and whether they're urban households or rural households living in agricultural settings, those food purchases add diversity to the food basket. The second question was about the relationship between household size and both diversity of diets and consumption of animal-sourced foods. I think that the relationship is positive, largely because in households with a larger number of family members, there's probably larger meals and also perhaps more adults or more children of a higher age. So if we think about a household that has only 3 household members, it might be that it's a mother, a father, and a young child. And in that household, there may not be as much diversity in the family meal as in a large household that might have many children of higher ages. So I can't say for certain exactly why the relationship between household size and dietary diversity is positive, but that is one hypothesis. Okay. Do we have another question?
Yes, I have, sorry, I have another question about the market as well, because in the last slide you said market is matter. So is the market is one factor associated with food diversity or not?
Yes. So market access in this case matters, and especially in a country like Nepal, because Nepal has a very large number of households that are living in very isolated settings. So those of you who are familiar with Nepal know that it's some parts of the country are very mountainous. And so in those mountainous areas, it may be very difficult for households to purchase food items because there are no markets available to them. And so what we find, not only in this research, but in other work that we've done, is that access to roads is very important. So where there are roads, households have better health outcomes, they have better nutrition outcomes, and they have better access to a diverse diet. So when households have access to those markets and are able to purchase food items that they can't grow themselves, it's very important. That's certainly true for rural households in agricultural areas, but it turns out to also be true for households in urban areas where households are close to markets. They tend to have greater dietary diversity because of easier access to a diverse set of foods.
So
later,
okay,
later,
sorry.
Yes, go ahead.
I would like to confirm if you also compare the household or village with market or village with no market or not, because it's similar to Laos that mountainous and many isolated village that have access, even they have access road, but they don't have market. So they also have late food diversity.
Right.
Yeah, but I just would like to confirm this point.
Okay.
Thank
So
you.
in this particular study, we don't have information on whether the village that the household lives in has a market. That information was not collected in this survey, but we have data from other surveys that show that the incidence of child stunting and child wasting is lower in areas where households have proximity or where villages have markets. So that pattern, although it's not something that we can measure with these data, it's something that we've seen in other data sets. So I think I don't want to overestimate or overemphasize the importance of markets, because it's true also that education and income matter to diversity. And so it's not only about markets, but obviously if households have higher incomes, then they need markets in order to translate that income into food purchases. I was going to also mention that later in the seminar series, I think maybe after January, we'll have a presentation from a study in Africa that looks much more closely at food environments and access to markets. So I think that'll be an interesting presentation. Maybe there's some other questions.
ถามภาษาลาวก็ได้เด้อ
Yes. Yeah. So I want to ask, I'll ask a question to maybe get the discussion
อเม
started.
ริกากับอันนั้นเนปาลส่งผ่านขอบใจ
Okay, so I'm showing the slide that shows dietary diversity by district, and yeah. So am I not sharing my screen? What? During the entire presentation? Wait, can you please confirm that with Dr. Ratipon? Because I see the presentation.
โนดมียังก็เฮ็ดอยู่ได้มันก็ไปอยู่คงเบื่อได้ขึ้นอยู่
Okay. So was it okay during the presentation? Yeah. Okay. So in Nepal, if we look at the foods that are most frequently consumed, the foods most frequently consumed in Nepal are cereals, spices, vegetable oils, and pulses. And those that are least frequently consumed are meat, fruit, dairy, fish, and at the very bottom of the list, eggs. So I'm wondering whether the audience thinks that in Lao, the order of items would be similar or different. And if you think that the order would be different, what would be different? So cereals, of course, would include rice. So I think rice is, yeah, rice. So cereals would be first because rice would be at the top of the list, I think, in Lao. With meat, fruit, dairy, fish, and eggs near the bottom. And of course, that would differ between urban areas and rural areas. So in many places, the consumption of eggs is very low. In Nepal, that's certainly the case. And there are lots of steps to encourage households to add eggs to their diet, but they tend to be very expensive in Nepal. And even for households that have chickens and raise eggs, often they will sell their eggs to generate income rather than consuming their own eggs. I wonder if that is similar in Lao. Are there any education programs in place in Lao that attempt to encourage households to add eggs or other animal-sourced foods to their diets?
True mind. Okay. They can hear us now.
The echo.
He's started working.
Sorry. Hi, Jerry. This is Rob.
Hi, Rob.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
So certainly, there are programs in Laos. The AHAN project, which was funded by the EU, was one that focused on animal source foods, inclusion of that in diets. And we've also, just to mention, CRS has a program in Myanmar where animal source foods is the priority nutritional sort of uptake through SPCC, but also through small scale livestock support. In the school meals program, we're also introducing eggs this year, this school year. Those will be locally or regionally procured eggs. So we're working on a very large purchase contract with an egg supplier.
Wow.
To integrate eggs at least 2 or 3 times a week into the school meals. And I think we'd be interested to, leveraging perhaps some of this type of research, but also the internal expertise of the ANRCB team and the ANRCB partners to see how we could sensitize communities, at least through the schools, on the importance of animal source foods and the importance of eggs in diets. Over. Thanks.
Yeah, so that's really interesting, and I think in a
Can you turn
place
the volume back up?
my observation is that in Nepal and in places like Nepal, the barrier to consumption of eggs or animal source foods in general is both a sort of knowledge barrier as well as an economic barrier. So in some cases, people know that animal sourced foods are nutritionally valuable for the kinds of micronutrients that they provide. But even if they're knowledgeable about that, they don't have the economic means to add those items to their diets. I think in other places in Nepal, there's just lack of knowledge about the importance of animal sourced foods. And so I think it's both in Nepal an economic and an educational issue. Nepal also is an area where dairy consumption is, while not high, it's not uncommon. So you see here that on average, more than 60% of households consume some dairy products. And when we're looking at animal sourced foods in Nepal, the primary category of animal sourced foods is not meat or eggs or fish, but consumption of dairy. I would think that that's very different for Laos. I would expect that dairy consumption is not as popular in Laos as it is in Nepal. Am I correct? popular in urban but not rural areas. Okay. So someone posted the link. You posted the link to the FAO data from LPDR, the National Food Consumption Survey 2016 and 17. So that's 2,000 households. Has anyone looked at those data?
Yes. Hello, Jelly.
Yes.
Sompon, speaking. Can I speak loud?
Yes, please.
ด้วยอาจารย์ขอเว้าลาวซะเพราะว่าเสียงแหบแน่
ได้เบาโลด
โดย
สมพร
อนาถโดยขออนุญาตเนาะเจ้า เพราะว่าเว้าเรื่องข้อมูลการกินของประเทศลาวอันดับหนึ่งถ้าเบิ่งอยู่ในแพลตฟอร์มตัวนี้ที่ว่าเฮาได้เอาเข้าหั้นนะอาจารย์ที่ว่าพวกเฮาเฮ็ด Deadline Survey ของสถาบันเฮา
Right.
2016-2017 เฮาเฮ็ดอยู่3ภาคแล้วก็เฮ็ดเก็บกำ2ฤดู ในนั้นอันดับหนึ่งก็สิแม่นซีเรียลหั่นเลยเนาะโดยเฮาใช้โปรแกรม IMU ข้อวิเคราะห์เฮาสามารถถ้าว่าเฮาได้เข้าไปเบิ่งอยู่ในแพลตฟอร์มตัวนี้เฮาจะได้เห็นว่าข้อมูลอยู่ของประเทศลาวเฮาก็ในการกินแต่ละฤดูมันก็แตกต่างกัน ส่วนว่าประเภทซีเรียลนี่จะสูงเป็นมีนเป็นเขาเอิ้นว่าอาหารหลักของเขาเจ้าเลย ส่วนว่าซีนไข่ปลาหรือนมก็น้อยๆลงมาคล้ายๆกับข้อมูลของเพิ่นโซเลยเจ้าก็เลยอยากแชร์ลิงก์ถ้าผู้ใดสนใจมันก็มีหลายประเทศเนาะที่ว่าข้อมูลละหนึ่งในนั้นก็มีของลาวเฮานำก็เลยแชร์ลิงก์เข้าไปด้วย
Yeah, I've put the metadata on the screen. So I wasn't aware of these data, but I'll look at them. It looks like there is some additional data. These are individual food survey data, not household, correct? Is this individual data or household data? Does anyone know? Yeah, okay. So the data set has one representative per household. So it's individual data. It seems like it would be a very interesting set of data for a student study. Other questions or observations? So wait, somebody's asked a question in the chat. What is the key socio-demographic determinant of food diverse consumption in Nepal, and is it different by districts? Yes. So the question is, what are the key socio-demographic determinants of food diversity in Nepal, and are they different by district? And the answer is yes, they're different by district, and Nepal is an area that's ethnically diverse. The country has several major ethnic groups that have, to some extent, different levels of socioeconomic status, but they also have different religious beliefs, different religious practices, and some of those include different attitudes and beliefs about food. So there's definitely socio-demographic differences in the population, and to some extent those are correlated with geography. They're concentrated in some districts more than others. The other thing about Nepal is that there's a lot of diversity in the landscape. So from very low-lying areas near the border with India to, of course, the Himalayas, very high mountains along the border with Tibet and China. Okay. I'm happy to answer other questions or have additional discussion. And again, let me put my, I'm going to put my email address up here. So if you have additional questions that you'd like to ask, feel free to write to me. Here's my email address. I'd be happy to answer other questions. A review on best practices in Nepal or interventions. Yes. So that would be the subject, that could be a subject for another seminar, but I will make one observation here in terms of the findings in the statistical analysis. And the finding is, I think, important as we think about policy, because it does present a challenge for policy, at least in the context of Nepal. And that's that the magnitude of the relationships that we observe are all statistically strong, but fairly small in magnitude. And so as policy variables, education is important, but the ability to influence dietary diversity through education alone or through some of these other variables alone is very limited. And so I think that speaks to the need for very targeted interventions. So identifying populations at high risk and making sure that the interventions and the programs and policies are targeted at the individuals or the households that are at greatest risk. And that's probably a good message to end on. So I want to thank everyone for your attention, for coming this morning, and I hope you'll be able to join us for the next seminar on November 2nd on iron deficiency and anemia. They'll be led by a colleague from Purdue University who's an expert on that subject. So thank you again.
โอเคขอบใจหลายๆเด้อ Thank you Professor Jerry
ครับชาย
Thank you ขอบใจทุกๆคนเด้อที่เข้าร่วมการสัมมนาเฮาตัวนี้เนาะขอให้โชคดีโอเคบ๊ายบาย
Bye bye.
Bye bye.